Institute, which is a sponsor of this conference, which we're very pleased to do. The Institute aims to build collaborative networks, and I can already hear and see from the buzz that's happening here that this is going to be a fantastic networking building occasion for us all. In this context, it's my pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker, Professor Rupert Wegerif from Exeter University. Many of you, I'm sure, will know of him and know that he has an extensive publication record and has been involved in a number of major projects and has very diverse research interests, which in discussion with him focus in around dialogue and dialogic learning. And from my own background as a teacher, I was particularly interested to see that he is particularly interested in 8 to 10-year-old students, because he feels that's a time when very often students can disengage from formal education, and he's bringing his understanding of dialogue and its role in thinking and reasoning for the individual and the group, with and without technologies, in particular the internet, to ask what is happening here and how can we understand this better. On one of his web pages, he's got this phrase which I think is very nice: learning to think is about being drawn into dialogues. And I was also attracted to the dialogues, and I'm thinking, having read his abstract where he's obviously going to challenge and problematize the notion of boundaries, that I'm sure he will provide a really stimulating introductory address to what's already been, I think, a conference that's well on the way to a fantastic occasion. So it's my pleasure to introduce Rupert. He will speak for
less than an hour.
Less than an hour. I have signs. And then there may be time for questions and dialogue at the end. So you're welcome.
Oh, thank you very much, Bronwyn. I'll just move this up a little. Is that working? Can you hear me? I have got far too much content, but I hope it won't take too long, and I hope that people are relaxed and will still be in this room, so we'll get some dialogue afterwards. And if you look really bored, I'll stop, but I'll have a go now. First of all, of course, thank you very much to everyone who invited me. I can't see Jane here. I guess she's terribly busy with all. Oh, there you are, Jane. Thank you very much. It's great. Yes, sunny. You should see what it's like in England. It's horrible. And I've been having one. I went to Rupert just yesterday, so it's wonderful to be here. And this conference looks extremely interesting. I'm already learning an awful lot. I'm learning a lot about back-teen, so I hope you don't think I'm here as the back-teen expert. Like many people, I've encountered back-teen through my own specialism of dialogic education, of technology in particular. So I'm going to talk about my particular response, my personal response to back-teen, how he's inspired me and my work. I'm not trying to provide a definitive answer. And I'm going to try and address, hang on, I'll get it right in a minute. Yes, wonderful. I'm going to try and address far too much, basically, because when I saw I sent Jane a fairly educational abstract at first, because that's my area of expertise, and she said, can't you say a bit more like your book? You know, I've just done an interesting book on dialogic education for the internet age, something a bit broader, a bit more interdisciplinary, which I'm delighted to do, because I particularly love theory, and I just want to try and explore this concept of boundaries, question what we mean by boundaries. We have this idea of dialogue at the boundaries, and whenever I read all these titles, boundary crossing, boundary this, I always imagine you have these areas of identity, and then you have the boundaries between them. So I'd like to problematize that from a Bakhtinian perspective, and argue that the boundary comes first, and that's why all this dialogue is possible in the first place. And then I'm going to try and show how that dialogic insight, inspired by Bakhtin, but not necessarily only from Bakhtin, can be applied to illuminate different areas. So I'm going to look at perception, art, neuroscience, individual development, education. Obviously, I'm not going to give you the total definitive answer. Obviously, there are many people here that will be much greater experts in each of these areas. So I hope you will challenge me afterwards, because I'm going to do the talk first. If you're really worried, you can put your hand up. Or if you really don't understand. So I'm going to have a go. One of the problems, of course, is being interdisciplinary. I like this cartoon. I used to have it on my door to frighten students, because everybody says you should always think outside the box, but actually it's not always a good idea. A lot of people thinking outside their particular box make a terrible mess, so I'm going to try and avoid making a mess. I'm going to... Bakhtin was an interdisciplinary thinker. Of course, his ideas, through readings of Dostoevsky and Rabelais and so on, went far beyond his field. They explored everything. And I think we can do interdisciplinary thinking if we think through the depth, if we don't try and do some sort of overview. I particularly think that this dialogic insight of Bakhtin has the potential to inform and illuminate many different areas. So that's what I'm going to try and argue, and of course end with some suggestions for how this conference could take this dialogic theory forward into the future. So let's start by looking at some of the things that Bakhtin said about boundaries. I was inspired by the fact, because there's quite a lot of dialogic education around. A lot of it's very much based on oracy, on face-to-face conversations from Socrates onwards. And this is actually associated to some extent with elite universities and so on. So I was inspired by this idea that the clash of texts brings light and illumination. Light is a popular word for Bakhtin, this idea of illumination at boundaries. And the other important thing is to see that boundaries, this last quote here, I hear voices in everything and dialogic relations between them. This idea of the dialogic relation, which I'm going to just unpack a little bit more, is taking this metaphor of dialogue, of in a sense, the mutual inclusivity of the boundary. The boundary isn't just a line, it's an inclusive boundary in which voices include each other and dialogue together. So it's a different way of thinking about boundaries. But I'm going to start by thinking about what he means by this challenging the formula of identity, because he was putting forward a dialogic principle as a challenge to this identity principle. So what do we mean by this identity principle? Most people seem to source it to Aristotle, but with the advantage of the internet, I plowed through Aristotle and I couldn't find it anywhere. There's a lot of talk about space, about the idea that objects can't occupy the same space, but this isn't quite the same as A equals A. I think you really find this principle of identity that defines monologism with Leibniz. And note the date, because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. It was around about 1690, founding classical logic on a thing is what it is and not another thing. And this is what Bakhtin is challenging. And this, of course, this challenge to identity thinking links his thought to various strands that sometimes called postmodern, with Heidegger's identity and difference, which was very much picked up by Derrida and difference. And it was after reading those authors that I read Bakhtin, so my reading is very influenced by that, and I hope that will be useful, so I'm going to see what you think. I'm just going to give you, I'm sorry, I have this sort of twitch. Whenever I'm talking, I kind of need to drink. So if you just bear with me, I have a cup, really. I'm not sure why. I guess it's a nervous thing, but it's so interesting how the body isn't always conscious, because I don't feel nervous, but I have need to drink. Sorry about that. So let's carry on. So what is this principle? Let's explore this principle and see how it can be challenged, because it's all about boundaries. So I want to explore what do we mean by a boundary. Boundaries are really important. All of our reality is constructed through boundaries. There's me and you, there's now and then, there's here and there. We always think on the other side of boundaries. So what are we saying with the A equals A? Well, I think you can do a very easy illustration. Basically, you have an identity, and It's what it is, and it's not another thing, and that makes sense, doesn't it? But there's something that hasn't been thought through in this idea of identity, in this principle of identity that Leibniz and most logical thinking starts with. And that, of course, is how do we get that boundary in the first place? Somehow there must have been a drawing of the boundary. But we can't see that because we can only be conscious after these boundaries have been drawn. We can only be conscious of a figure and a ground. So how does the figure get there? The other thing that's implicit there is this is a drawing on something. Now, this, obviously, when you have a figure, you have a foreground. I can focus on one person and all the others become a background. But the ground on which boundaries are originally drawn is not the ground of a figure. It's, well, Heidegger refers to an aberrand, I think, but Derrida talks a lot about Mallarmé, the poet's account of how the white page seems to be pregnant with meaning before he cuts it with a pen, and how the meaning of the poem isn't to be found in the words, but in the space between them. There's some sense here of pregnancy, of potential, of a sort of infinite potential that the boundaries are drawn on. So if we return to this identity, we can see it quite differently. We can see that that identity depends on the other, that A depends upon B, and is defined by B. And this is obviously brought out by Bakhtin, I think quite well by the joke Bakhtin repeats in the introduction to his last book of essays, that the ancient Greeks didn't know the most important thing about themselves, that they were ancient Greeks. Who we are is mediated by the other is not elsewhere. It's always a figure on the ground, and the insight that I'm drawing from Bakhtin is that that relationship is dialogic. They're not separate, they're dialogic. The other is always in the self is always in the other. They are defined against each other. So what's the boundary then? Because this is the sort of original and archetypal boundary. Think of a thing, any kind of thing, however vague, you have to have a boundary around it to make it thinkable. You have to define it against another. But then if we question that boundary, we're opening onto that infinite potential that was already cut by the boundaries which define us. This is it. It opens it up. So the boundary isn't just a closure, it's potentially an opening. An opening onto the light of illumination. Of course, the light isn't just there, it doesn't mean anything in itself, as Bakhtin brings out, and infinity is something that Bakhtin refers to quite a lot. This infinite meaning is the relationship between a text and the context, between a focus and the ground. The ground of any focus is unbounded. This is our experience, isn't it? Surely, if we focus on anything that consciousness focuses on and pays attention to, we'll reduce the rest to a ground which has no particular limits. So there's an infinite potential of meaning if we scratch and remove those boundaries. One way to understand infinity that I found very useful here, why are we talking about infinity, it's not in a mathematical sense. I think we have some maths experts here, and there are all sorts of fancy infinities in mathematics. It's in the more everyday language sense of not finite, not bounded, not limited. And this is a very important category for Levinas. I'm not sure if he was influenced by Bakhtin or not, certainly influenced by Buber. But he contrasts the totality of a representational system to the infinity invoked by the face of the other. I think that infinity is essential to understanding dialogic relations. And I better not spend too long talking about this. I can't see many slides. Why is the face of the other infinite? Well, I'm going to argue that it's intrinsic to the dialogic relationship. In a dialogue, as you can see here, in a sense, I'm standing up and talking. I have all of you in my field of vision. In a sense, I encompass you, and I might think that I understand you, and I can define you, and I know what I try and think, or I know what you're thinking. But at the same time, you're looking at me up here. I'm part of your world, and you're linking everything I say to your horizon, to your background, to your experiences. In a dialogue, we sort of envelop each other. And that relationship, it's a bit like a Mobius strip, but less mathematical. It implies an infinite opening, because actually I can't understand you, I can't contain you, you are transcendent to me, precisely because you find me. So in that mutual attempt to envelop each other, there is an infinity, an opening of transcendence, as Levinas says. And I think that makes sense to me, why Bakhtin is frequently talking about this infinite potential that could be closed down if we try and relate everything together in a logical system, which he accuses Hegel of doing, of closing down that infinite potential. So, let's just unpack what we mean here by dialogism, read on the other side of Heidegger, Derrida, and so on, or read by me anyway, which is some of the things that are coming out here. But I think it's all very much from Bakhtin as well. This is my reading of Bakhtin. The meaning emerges from the tension between incommensurate perspectives. I use incommensurate because Leibniz was arguing that reason could reduce everything to that identity, to that equal sum. But what people are cannot be reduced to each other. I cannot be you, you cannot be me. There's no dialectical overcoming of our opposition in some synthesis. We are not commensurate. We can't be reduced to the same scale. And that leads to a certain kind of tension in the relationship, which is creative. And all meaning actually implies that there's more than one voice, that it's not a single perspective. This isn't always obvious, but things would not stand out in awareness unless there was a possibility of there being otherwise. You wouldn't say something unless there was another voice implicit. Dialogic relations implies that the mutual attunement and mutual envelopment, so the self and the other are intertwined and inseparable. And dialogue involves this infinite opening, potential meaning. This is more than an epistemology. Some people like Rupert and Linnell in linguistics seem to treat it mainly as an epistemology of how we get to know about the world, but I think it's clearly an ontology. It's about what's really there. What's really there, and this is brought out very much by Bakhtin's account of thought striving to embrace the world, but also experiencing itself in the world. So the implication is that the ultimate truth is not a representation of a world of some sort, but it's precisely that reversible relationship. Not a formula, but a relationship, an open and infinitely creative relationship with this ungraspable whole. Because the implication is, if we're part of this integrated whole of the universe, then we can't possibly step outside of it and grasp it. As Bakhtin says, in our attempt to understand it, in a sense we are dispossessed. You know, we are, it's ungraspable, and that's when we experience the infinite. This is another thing from Levinas, but I think it's kind of true that infinity is an indication of the ungraspableness of our situation. So, having set up my understanding of dialogues, I'm now going to apply them briefly to the perceptual world and art, and I will get a movement because I'm covering far too much territory. But is that okay so far? Does that make sense? Yeah? Useful? Well, some packing. Oh, thanks, Steve. Yeah. Well, I'm not just randomly choosing different areas to try and illuminate. I think there's a story here which I hope will emerge. I'm not going to say a lot about art. I'm getting this from Merleau-Ponty, who said a great deal about art, who seemed to focus on the phenomenology of perception, looking at artists, visual artists. Of course, Bakhtin looked at literary artists. Merleau-Ponty unpacked Cézanne and others. But what he's exploring, which I think is very important, something that came up in a talk the other day, is the dialogic nature of the physical. The fact that physical space isn't ultimate, isn't fixed, which is something we sort of taught in school, but is actually constructed. And this is this idea of the reversibility. And it's actually a dialogic relation with the body, which I want to explore briefly. I like this idea of horizons, is one way of explaining it. Where I live in Devon, it's a bit like there are spaces that are very open, and you can stand up on Dartmoor or on a tour. I don't know if you've seen Dartmoor, but it's a big space. And you create a horizon around yourself, and it's your horizon, it's unique to you. But if you stand up there, you probably feel a little bit nervous, because suddenly it's as if the horizon's looking back at you. So as we create our own horizon, we look out at the world, it's as if the world looks back and locates us. It's always a double relationship. And it's very much obvious when you look at the touching. So this, the physicalness of the world is one side of my body's on the other side, it's because my body's physical. The world and my body are two sides of the same coin, if you like. They construct each other, but they construct each other creatively. Let's see if we can explore this with an experiment. I'm going to suggest an experiment for everybody. We're going to find out where the boundaries really are. So if you touch your chest with your hand, and you try very hard and feel yourself touching, feel yourself as a hand. Might help if you close your eyes. And now, feel yourself being touched. Feel yourself, you're the chest, you're being touched, something else is touching you. And what I want you to try and get a sense of by moving onto both sides, get a sense of that boundary. Where is it located? Can you feel the boundary between the two? Now let's try it with something outside of the body. Let's say, touch your chair. You touch a table. So can you feel yourself touching it? Can you also try, with a bit of effort, to feel yourself being touched by it? And just like when you walk through the air touches you and you touch the air. So where's that boundary? That's the question. Have you felt the boundary? Have you experienced the boundary? The boundary of the body? Which is everywhere. When you look out, there's also a boundary. Sometimes it's interesting to look at the darkness around the eyes, around the vision, that boundary there. Where's that located? What's behind it? Just in this blackness behind the vision. My suggestion is, of course, that the boundary actually isn't located, because it's out of these boundaries that we construct the visual world. The visual world, the physical world, so-called physical world, only exists because we construct it out of these particular boundaries, out of our senses and so on. We construct this image of the world in which we live. But the boundaries themselves are, in a sense, what locates that world. The boundary is an inclusive space between the body and the world. And this is where we really live. This is where there's this opening of creative potential of meaning. You all look blank and you're not convinced. Come and try it, because it projects you into the real space of meaning, out of which we construct physical spaces, literary spaces, art spaces, and that it gives us some insight into what art is about. Art, for me, is, I say, a personal insight that helped me to understand that the body world isn't just my body and the world. Every figure ground, the body is then participating and intertwined with the world. So when you look at a sculpture, you have to, in a sense, embody that sculpture, just as you can become a tree. When you look at a tree, you can't really tree it. When I look at the tree, I'm not just seeing patterns of light. I can feel the physicality of the tree because I have a body, because my body, in a sense, participates in empathy with that tree. So that this whole world is a collection of my body's roots, and it's through our embodiment that we understand and construct the physical world. And it's a creative and dialogic construction. It seems to be automatically given, but that's where art is useful, because art can help us to question and expand the possibilities of vision and perception and our understanding, and to question the everydayness that we find ourselves thrown in. We're almost trapped in a world that we have constructed. But the real space we inhabit is a space of infinite potential meaning, out of which we construct different worlds through our interactions. And that's what Bakhtin is saying. There are no things, there are relationships, dynamic and dialogic relationships. I think it's important to look at the physical, because I think that's the biggest monological illusion that we have, where we're suffering from. You leave your science class at school and you know that everything's really physical and solid. And if people still have some sort of fantasy, that's because, non-physical things, that must be because of their weird faith position or something like that. But actually, it's all matter, and it's all located. But it's not located unless you locate it, unless you interact with it. I hope that makes some sense, but it might inspire some thoughts. So let's move away from this idea then, that the units of meaning, clearly reality is constructed out of figure ground combinations in perception. This is the unit of consciousness. And see if this can give some insight into recent work in cognitive neuroscience. I was interested to try and explore consciousness, and looking at summaries of consciousness. There's a good one by Stanislas Dehaene, who gave a keynote at the early conference we held in Exeter, so I was able to talk to him a little bit and introduce him to the European Association of Research on Learning and Instruction. And he's a great researcher, but he's very naive, of course, because like many scientists in these areas, he assumes that we can reduce everything to the movement of neurons. But the summaries of consciousness, when he says consciousness, he's talking about what I would call, we could call self-reflective consciousness, distinctively human, although maybe there's some variations with, orangutans and what have you, but mainly human. You don't get consciousness, people are not conscious of themselves without paying attention, without acts of attention. Those acts of attention are acts that carve a figure in the ground, if you think about it. Every act of attention you make is going to focus on something, is going to produce a figure ground, gestalt. And he was looking at this in terms of vision, and he demonstrated the attentional blink effect. So he's actually measuring that boundary that we talked about. All of reality is constructed out of figured ground, perceptual reality. In other words, prospecting, there are lots of voices out there, all competing for your attention. Visually, as well as... And the boundary around them can actually be measured in terms of time, because you put an equally strong image on a screen, and you'll find that it can't even be seen, it can't be recognized for a certain amount of time, because the brain will only take in one image at a time. So it causes the attentional blink effect. You with me so far? I find this very interesting, because we're actually looking at the building blocks of reality here in neuroscience. And that's where the naivety comes in, of course, because if we're looking at the building blocks of reality, well, anyway, we'll go there. But so, how can we understand this? Well, this is fed into what is probably the most popular model of consciousness at the moment. It's a theatre metaphor of consciousness. And the idea is that in the background mind is active. It's unconscious but active. There are billions of voices murmuring away. And I believe that the potential of neuronal links is actually greater than the potential of different configurations of neurons is greater than the number of atoms in the universe. So the brain might look small, but it's actually quite a big space. And if you think about it, everything's in that space. Anything one could possibly think of, there's a neuronal correlate, there's something going on in your brain. So they're talking about this background, and what happens is they make links, the voices murmur away. When they get loud enough, when enough people are talking, when enough of these little neurons, sorry, they're not people, I'm anthropomorphizing them, but when enough of these neuronal clusters are going, they take over the center stage and they broadcast globally. And then we experience consciousness. But up until that point, we're unconscious. So this is the theatre model. When you get onto the stage, the lights come on and everybody can see you, but they're still out there in darkness, still murmuring away. I think that's really interesting, because it leads to... I'll just talk about another blink before I come back to that model and explore one of the problems with it. There's also another kind of mind blink that they find when they're studying creativity. If they look at people having aha experiences, you can engineer these with these kind of word problems, and then you wire them up and you wait till they get an insight. You can see the brain activity before they get an insight. You can predict when they're about to have an insight, even though they don't know it, because of the alpha waves. And this is, so there's this alpha band of electrical activity just before the aha moment. And they call this a brain blink, because the alpha is associated with deep relaxation. And before, as the insight arrives, people actually try and blink. They turn their eyes back, they close their eyes, because they have to be open to something that's coming from the brain, as it were. It's just emerging. And this is another example of how these neurons working in the background will unconsciously produce answers, generate answers. And all this sort of research has led to the claim that consciousness is epiphenomenal. I don't know if you know Daniel Dennett, but he argues this based on these findings from a researcher called Wegerif. But when, for instance, people are going to make a decision, the brain knows what decision they're going to take before they do. And if you ask them, they won't know, but then, in fact, they've already decided. So the argument is that the brain's just doing it all for us. We're not really, self-consciousness is just a pretty declaration, but actually we don't have free will, it's all a determined system. But that is a classic example of this monological thinking. If you look at this diagram, I wonder if I've got another one. Sorry, pointing in the wrong direction. Me being confused by my own image there, it's interesting. It's like looking at yourself in the mirror and imagining you're a physical body. Right. So where's this boundary that they've drawn? They've drawn this neat little boundary, and because we're invoked to this illusion of physicalism, we look at people, we imagine it's all in that little brain there. But everything's in the brain, If if I feel a pain in my finger, I guess there's something going on in the brain, but there's still a pain in my finger. That tree out there, maybe there's something in my finger, still out there. But this boundary is not a real boundary. Anything you can possibly think of is part of that background. The visual world is part of your background. It is the ground of your focus of attention. And that's therefore shared with other people. You know, just as you could both see the totem pole, no, you can't see that. You can both see the sign. You can all see the screen. So we all know about the Queen of England, or we all know about the latest events in Thailand. Probably don't. I've been looking in the news. But we all have a lot of a shared space, and we all know a lot of things. So what they're confusing there with this LIBET thing is a dialogue, basically. When you solve the problem, it's still you solving the problem. You have to pay attention. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I have a difficult issue, I'll get answers in strange forms that I don't recognize. Maybe a tune will come into my mind. And I think, why am I thinking that tune? It's linked to the problem. We asked the question, and the background brain is providing the answer for us. It's a dialogue. The consciousness is not just that central bit of light, that central focus. It's the whole thing. It's the ground and the background. Just as in vision, you have the focused figure, and you have the ground. So in consciousness, you have the focus of attention, and you have the background, and it's all us. Does that make sense? So that's a misunderstanding about LIBET. Okay, maybe the conscious you isn't fully sure what decision you're going to take. It doesn't mean you as a whole are not making the decision. Why? Because you as a whole are a dialogue. You're a dialogue between the focus and the ground. That would be my argument. And that helps to understand these effects, these blink effects, the attentional blink and the awareness blink. At least it helped me to understand it. And it helps to understand this strange finding from LIBET. So understanding this dialogic is helping. That helps, but it also helps to understand why thinking isn't individual. Because thinking doesn't occur in that little focused and analytical bit. It occurs in the dialogue between figure and ground. And in that dialogue, we are united with others and with culture, and we have a shared space. We don't only have a shared physical space that we've constructed together, and I'm sure many people will be experiencing it quite differently from you, but we sufficiently constructed it together to have a shared space. We have a shared cultural space. And of course everyone experiences it slightly differently. Just as in a landscape, everyone's horizon is slightly different, but a lot of it is overlapping. This is why Bakhtin refers to the identity in difference of culture, the complex unity of human culture as a whole. When we understand that the thinking is occurring in that figure-ground dialogue, you realize that the ground is not individual, it's largely a shared ground, which is why it's possible in a dialogue for thinking to move forward with multiple voices, because although when we speak, we think, oh, we're just that voice, we're just that single individual, when we listen, we're part of the whole ground. So they're both sides. There's the speaking and the listening, there's the individual apparently separate, and there's the collective space. And I think that's essential to understanding dialogic as a source of potential for collective thinking. And I better rush on because I've set myself a ridiculous task of trying to illuminate far too much. But we're basically doing okay. I've lost my timekeeper, so that's fortunate. Right, right, okay. Well, what about, I think for me the clearest example of where the relationship comes first is when you think about somebody becoming a self. Again, with this very strange physical illusion, which is perpetuated by schooling mainly, because it's not actually science. If you look at quantum physics, you'll see that an electron is somehow implicit in the whole of the universe. You know, it's 19th century science taught in schools, this idea of physicalism. But anyway, we associate cells with bodies, even though that's obviously not really true, because some bodies have several cells, and they can get bodies with no cells. They're called zombies, but I believe they exist. But anyway, how does a self appear in the first place? Well, you start with a relationship. There's a relationship with the baby, even though there's no person there. There's and this is there's a video here which I can't show because it doesn't work for some reason. But there's a newborn baby, and the father sticks his tongue out, and the baby sticks his tongue out back. It's newborn. It's already wired to respond, to recognize faces, gestures, and to respond. And this is how you start with this relationship. And I think when you have this relationship, there's lots of experiments done which kind of cruel really, where they get mothers not to respond, have a stony face. And after a while, the baby's desperate to get a response. After a while, it shows obvious signs of distress and confusion and gets very unhappy and so on. But why? And the mothers find this extremely hard. Why do mothers smile? I mean, is it because they want to smile? Because the baby smiles, the mother smiles. And why does the baby smile? Because the mother smiles. The relationship is what is motivating it. And not understanding that leads to all sorts of bad science where they try and argue for some sort of hardwired capacity to interact in the individual. But what's really there is the relationship which is motivating the actions. You don't need individual machines, if you see what I mean. The relationship is coming first. And what I find particularly interesting is Trevarthen, an English researcher in the 70s, actually wanted to prove that it was about the contingent responsiveness. So he got the mothers on videos. Some mothers were doing all the right things, smiling, waving, peekaboo, out of sync, not related to the baby. The baby got equally distressed. When the mother was in sync, contingently responding, the baby was happy. And I think that's important, because it gets away from some of this physicalism that it's all about bodies. You know, you might think, obviously, the baby can smell the mother. No, the baby it's the relationship that's important. And therefore, those relationships can be mediated by new technology. They can be carried through Skype, through the internet. They can become global. They're not just physical, face-to-face. So, how do babies become self? Well, they start off saying things like, you know, Sammy can do it. Sammy drives. Why are they referring to themselves in the third person? It takes a long time for babies to be able to say I effectively. Who are they talking to? Well, it's not just the mother. Obviously, there's a relationship with the mother or the father or whoever's there. But it's also, I suspect, this is where the super addressee, or the otherness that Bakhtin talks about, the witness, comes in from the very beginning. It's the relationship. It's the voice of that relationship. And it's within a relationship that you eventually learn to say I. You're actually, sorry, skipping the slide, you're actually internalizing a bit of that relationship. You learn, there's all sorts of work on this, but I haven't got time, but you learn that the mother sees things in a different way from you, that your perceptions are different. It's a bit of a shock at first, but then you learn out of a relationship with the other that you have a particular role. So the relationship comes first. The relationship's actually bigger than us. And I mean, what would be the point of being an I if there wasn't a you and an us and a them? I mean, it's actually a collective, the thinking's collective. But because of this little trick of consciousness, when we're only self-conscious on one side of this circle, we imagine we're separate and cut off. Actually, we're connected and thinking is collective, but it has many voices. And that's an implication, that is the dialogic metaphor, which is fairly clear in Bakhtin. So how can, I mean, very, very briefly, this is my main work, is applying this in education and developing dialogic education. It has obvious implications, particularly this nice contrast in Bakhtin between the authoritative voice that remains outside you, that you either accept or reject. I mean, we think of Stalin because it's Bakhtin, but you can also think of a sign that says no smoking. You know, you either say, okay, I want to smoke, or okay, I'll smoke, you know, whatever. I'll reject it, I'll be a rebel. But then, what if your friend explains how her mother died of lung cancer after smoking, she really doesn't want you to smoke? That's a persuasive voice, that will enter into you, that might affect you and change you. And of course, many people, when Bakhtin mentions the authoritative discourse, he uses the example of teaching. You know, many people have seen teaching as authoritative transmission, but that doesn't develop a self. The self only develops and expands through an internally persuasive voice, which gives you different repertoires, which enables you to take on different positions. And that's an important insight for teaching. I wanted to give lots of examples here, but I realized when I ran it through in my hotel room that you'd be here for hours and probably wouldn't thank me. But basically, I think the important thing is that we need to expand the space of dialogue as well as the contents of dialogue in teaching. So, you know, if you give somebody a graph, you need to explain that it's not only that this graph has affordances for doing certain things, playing around with numbers, but that the moment that you've divided your paper into lots of lines, you can't do other things. You can't do beautiful swirly drawings like the Maoris do here, all sorts of meanings that you can't do. Everything you do in education is, and that's where it relates to these other points. The word teaching in English is taken from to pointing. We're pointing things out to people, you're directing their attention, you're shaping the neural roots which will construct their reality. And if you're doing that, you should have the responsibility of doing it in a way that keeps things open. Instead of saying, this is the truth, you have to say, this is one perspective on the truth, there are always other perspectives, and allow the children to maintain their perspectives. The correct answer, you can teach them the correct answer, but it's always the point of view of the examiner. It's not the correct answer in itself, it's in a dialogue. The good student will learn what the examiner wants. It doesn't mean they have to forget everything else that they believe. So we have to deconstruct reality as we construct it. That's probably a bit vague. I wanted to give examples, but it's 8:20, so I won't give any examples. Sorry. I got some lovely ones. You have to look at my website or read. Just email me and I'll send you one. But this is what I'm exploring at the moment. I think, the models of education, we still seem to quote Piaget and Vygotsky a lot, but actually if you explore them, they're quite rationalistic, they're talking about conceptual development. Is it possible to do an alternative dialogic model? That's what I'm trying to do at the moment, in the context of mathematics, working with Sibel, but also in science and other areas. Why mathematics and science? Because that's the heart of monologism in school. So if we can address that, then we can do anything, because obviously it's easy to do it in art education or citizenship. But anyway, there are these mechanisms that you can see. I mean, there's this opening a space of dialogue, deepening the space by questioning the assumptions, which is what Bakhtin's doing with his dialogic principle. I think he's deepening the space for all of us. Expanding the spaces by bringing in alternative voices. We have here voices from many disciplines that are doing that. But there are also, mechanisms to do with seeing from other perspectives, and they're not always physical perspectives. They're often virtual cultural perspectives. Most education goes with this, what Mead called the generalized other, the other of your community. So you're teaching them what are the ground rules in your community. This is what reasoning is. This is what any reasonable person would say. Or you have, it's a accountable talk movement in America. You're accountable to the community, to the rules of the community of sciences and so on. And that's very important, obviously, but that's kind of socialization. But it does take the form of this super addressee voice of the community. And what I want to argue is that infinite other that I was talking about is really important for critical thinking, because whatever your rules of reasoning in your community, there's always going to be a voice somewhere else, maybe in the Amazon or maybe hiding in a cave in Afghanistan. It's going to question that. It's going to have an alternative view. And if you want to think critically, you have to learn how not only to engage with these constructed, generalized others, but how to be open to this infinite other. It's not a fixed position. It's precisely that movement of always going beyond. There's always another voice. There's always a potential for a new meaning. And that's what Bakhtin's talking about by taking the outside point of view. It's not a real perspective. It's a sort of ideal potential tendency. It's a way of distancing yourself from yourself and seeing yourself as if from the outside, which is impossible but productive. So very cool. When did I start? I started late.
We started late.
Yeah. Because I'm only just getting on to the important bit, the internet and all that, the history of mind. This is one of the cave paintings that was done about 30,000 years ago. It's from South Africa. So I've just suggested that mind and technology are very bound together. Probably all heard of dialectical materialism. I think it's a bit of a busted flush. But now, but Bakhtin was a bit ambivalent and interested and very critical of some dialectics, but clearly, engaged with the Marxist tradition. What I'm going to suggest is that to understand the development of it can to some extent situate dialogic theory in history to do with not the mode of production, which was Marx's big thing, but the mode of communication. And we're looking at Bakhtin's core. Dialectics was born of dialogue, so as to return again to dialogue on a higher level, a dialogue of personalities. So he's interested in that dialectical theory and taking it further, but can we do it by understanding the way in which, can we rethink Marx, looking at dominant mode of communication, something that Habermas sort of suggested by saying that as well as this telos of production of man working on nature, transforming itself, and that's what it was all about. And of course it leads to polarization, conflict, the dictatorship of the proletariat. It sounds dreadful, was dreadful, but Bakhtin is talking about dialogue, the potential of dialogue. And Habermas pointed out that communication has an inbuilt telos towards trying to understand the other person, towards justice and truth that emerge from communication. And therefore, of course, the mode of communication becomes rather important in that direction of history. I'm not dismissing the production stuff, I'm just saying we need to augment it with communication and possibly return to this big vision of history, which I think could be quite important to have a sense of vision, a sense of direction. So we're replacing the Marx's little linear schema of modes of production. Let's look at the mode of communication and its limitations, its affordances. The word affordance doesn't mean it determines what happens, it means it makes some things easier and some things more difficult. And obviously there are many variations, there's a lot of scholarship in this area, but the big picture, we didn't actually start with face-to-face dialogue, we started with people are pretty short, hundreds of thousands of years of mimesis, of pantomiming, of imitating and pointing, and which is really interesting, because that gesturing became for oral language, and that involves a kind of split in the working memory. That involves seeing yourself from the outside so you know what effect your gesture is going to have on somebody else. So out of that emerged oral language, face-to-face dialogue, and it's very dialogic. It supports this participatory sense of self. We're all part of the, which is an iwi, we're all part of the tribe, we're all part of the community, and it produces a very nice morality. But interestingly, all the tribes tend to be fighting all the other tribes because it's face-to-face dialogue and you're part of the dialogue community. It's contained by space and time. Everything you say, you're listening to me now, you've probably forgotten what I've said in a couple of seconds, it disappears. So print came in and made it possible to transcend, to go global. You could write down, instead of having only a sacred mountain or a sacred lake, you could write down your truth and take it over the sea and convert people. You had little empires of religion and empires of writing, very much developed in support of empires. But also you get this, and you get this transcendence, a little bit of space and time, not complete transcendence, obviously. You get this movement. But you also get this danger of monologism. I would say that monologism is, in some extent, a product of the affordance of print. It's not possible without print, and it does sometimes happen when you get print. The idea that truth isn't an experience, a relationship, that it's a representation. You find it in the book. The knowledge is over there in the library. This is something that you only get with writing, particularly print. And the internet, which is coming in, has different features. It seems in some ways a return to the participatory and dialogic nature of oral cultures, but of course it's moving with media and print that also transcend space and time and go global. And that's what I was particularly interested in exploring. I hope you can bear with me for a few minutes. I have to rush forward. If we look at this in a systems approach, you can see that oracy is a bounded dialogue in a community. The problem is the boundary, really, the limitation. Writing. The issue, certainly with print writing, is someone controls the printing press. There's somebody who writes the law codes and then they're carried out to New Zealand or whatever. There's a centre periphery effect. You get this also with TV and radio. The internet is different. That's a map of the internet, by the way, but it's changing and expanding all the time. It has infinite potential for expansion and infinite links. And so but it's not just a return to writing. Oh yeah, I better rush over this one. I was so interested that Socrates criticised writing when it was coming in for its dangers, in much the way people are now criticising the internet, because he was advocating a dialogic truth, which is found in the Bible actually. It's this idea that the letter kills, but the spirit brings life, or something that is contrasting. That's the relationship. So you only get intelligence in a living relationship, so Socrates, not in the dead written word. Where was I going? So what I like about Bakhtin, of course, is this contrast of text. This is really interesting neuro. So a lot of people say, why do you bring that neuro stuff in? It doesn't tell us anything new. Well, sometimes it does. By studying oral people and literate people, you can see real differences, not necessarily huge, but real in their ways of thinking. In particular, this is because literate people, oral people, will not actually be able to hear words. They hear meanings. They sort of strand together. They can't separate out the words. But we can't even hear words without the visual cortex being activated, because we can see them. And it's only when you can see them that you start having this, this is a concept, let's analyze it, let's expand it, let's abstract, So it's a very different way of thinking. But interestingly, literate people are better at analytical thinking than holistic thinking. They're also worse at remembering faces. So there are various distinct differences in the constructed reality of people as a result of literacy. We're talking the effects of education here, education in shaping reality. So, very quickly, this whole idea of print, Gutenberg was most people weren't, of course, literate for most of the time. Writing's been around for thousands of years. It only has this huge impact on how we understand thinking. With the Enlightenment, after Gutenberg, you get this idea, instead of utterances in dialogues, you get these propositions in proofs. You know, there's a truth as a representation. I'm just pointing out that these are affordances, that you can use the same thing different ways. Reading aloud has a very different effect. The argument is that reading alone in your bedroom books, which like women started doing in the 18th century, actually generated this autonomous individual self, the sense that I'm separate from the world. But I'm trying to say far too much. Obviously that's what education is based on, 3 R's, you've got to teach them to read, write, arithmetic. The curriculum area is just a load of books that have to be transmitted into their grades. I mean, the logic of print is the logic of representation, and that's what our current education systems are based on. That would be the argument. Obviously I'm simplifying hugely, I haven't got time. But, so the internet then is very different, and I think backing helps us to understand it. I'll just give you another five minutes, so I'll slow down slightly. It's getting too fast, isn't it? 5 minutes, okay? Yeah. Jane said I could talk for as long as I like, so I'll follow. Because you'll still be here drinking, so you can always talk a bit about it and discuss later. What's the obvious difference? The obvious difference is this idea of knowledge. You know, my colleagues, until recently, and I think they say, oh, you can't use Wikipedia because anyone can influence Wikipedia. Well, encyclopedias, they're vetted, you have the best people doing. Well, recent studies have shown that not only is Wikipedia more up to date, which you'd expect, it's more accurate on almost every issue, but that's not the point. The point is you do need to check. You can't be sure who's written it. So even in the act of reading from Wikipedia, you're learning how to participate in knowledge construction. You're not just accepting the authority. And now the Encyclopedia Britannica has stopped printing, it's just disappeared. So this is a different participatory understanding of knowledge, which we're not necessarily teaching for. But it's, in a way, it's back to Socrates' idea that intelligence is in the dialogue, it's in the responsive word, it's not over there in the book, So the essence of Wikipedia knowledge is not passive representation of true knowledge, but active participation in dialogues. So Bhakti can help us understand this new logic and new activities of the internet. I don't have time to show this, but do look it up. It's this marvelous event on the internet. It's a performance by Eric Whiteacre where thousands, 2,000 people they recorded themselves in their rooms, sent them in, he put it together into a performance. My question is, and it's beautiful, and have a look at it, it's on YouTube, where is this event? Previously musical events, they took place in the Albert Hall or somewhere, and then you spread them out. So there's an authentic event and there's a virtual copy. This event only exists on the internet. So it is, whenever you press that button on YouTube, that's when it is. And that's where it is. And it's interesting, I Skyped my family, was it this morning? Yeah, it was this morning. Yeah. And, they're like, they were in England, I was here, they were, I don't know, Tuesday, I was Wednesday. Or was it the other way around? Something like that. But, where did that actually take place? So what I'm saying is that the internet has actually opened that space of, that dialogic space, the boundary I was talking about, that opening onto the infinite, which you get which opens up in a face-to-face dialogue, has expanded and taken over the planet. I mean, that's the space of the internet, it's a dialogic space, potentially. And therefore, it's the thing that does the locating. It isn't located. Where is the internet? The internet is where you try to find out where you are. You can Google yourself and find out where you are. The internet doesn't have a location because it's a dialogic space. And so what's happening to identity now? Recent studies show that, well, my son, I'll give an example, but I think he's typical. All his friends, they get home from school, they're on their laptops or on the computers, and things happen. He tells me about the adventures he had. I mean, from my point of view, he's like a zombie, he's hypnotized, he's sitting there. But he tells me about all these extraordinary things and the people he met, and because they're playing games, they're running around and playing cowboys and Indians and various three-dimensional websites. So not cowboys and Indians, because they're more like, I don't know, they're weird monsters. But still, interesting. I love this, don't worry, we're from the internet. What kind of identity happens when from your childhood on, From very early childhood, I used to play Mario Kart with him, and you get people coming in from Japan, from Russia, from everywhere. Where do they live now? Where do they exist? I think it's different. Oh, keep pressing the wrong thing again. And I think this relates to Bakhtin's account of great time and this interconnectedness of humanity. So the internet has this potential of embodying Bakhtin's idea of a dialogue between all voices, all times and places. They're actually all increasingly existing on the internet. And as we've seen, consciousness is not individual, it's a figure-ground dialogue. So as we learn to think with the internet, we become part of a collective consciousness. Very quickly, one example, not necessarily a good example, not everyone likes it. What interests me is this Avast, which I'm part of, I suppose, is that it's using an internet logic. It has no committee, it has no central head who decides. They say they poll their members, and whatever issues come up, then they make them big. So sometimes it's, I don't know, bears being mistreated in China, sometimes it's oil rights in Bolivia. It emerges from the base. They have millions of members, and it's what they're talking about. Doesn't that remind you of this theatre model of mind? Instead of the neurons murmuring away and then something taking on the stage, you have billions of voices talking to each other with their Twitter and Facebook, and only when they reach a certain threshold does it get globally broadcast. You can see global thinking occurring rather badly with all sorts of barriers and boundaries because of the hangover of physical identities, but it's emerging. And it's, if you like, it's the horizon of our times. It's this great time that Bakhtin was talking about. It's in a sense the aspiration, this is Coronto, of dialogue of all voices with all. It's a sort of implicit aspiration of dialogue which the internet is helping us to give some sort of physical form to. Of course, there are no final words, as we know, but these not final words are the Bakhtin's principle of dialogism can help open up new ways of thinking about art, neuroscience, these different areas. But more than that, some of these themes are shared, so that what we learn from art and perception we can apply to neuroscience, and we can apply to understanding teaching as the shaping of consciousness, the shaping of this paying attention. And the main thing that we're learning, why it's possible to do this, why interdisciplinary thought is possible, is because that boundary actually comes first, which is quite paradoxical and difficult to understand, because everything we see things and boundaries between them, because we're always on the other side of the drawing of all these boundaries. But actually, the boundary is what constitutes the identity and makes it possible. So opening up the boundary opens up possibilities of interdisciplinary thought and moves us towards great time. And the internet has this enormous potential, but of course we don't have to realize that potential. It's not a determinism here. But it goes way beyond the original dialogic, which Socrates mystified as the breath. I think it's interesting that breath in Greek is pneuma, which is also a word they use for the spirit. He was saying it's all about the breath, and so you can't have technology can't mediate. People are still saying the same sort of thing. It's all about our physical responsiveness to others, so if we live on the internet, there's a moral crisis here, because people aren't Hubert Dreyfus, the phenomenologist, did an attack on the internet on those lines. But it's very similar to Socrates. It's, we're not really open to the new here. We're not taking what Bakhtin called the prophetic attitude. But is the future going to be this return to dialogue at a higher level? Well, I would argue that it very much depends on us, and I hope that's something that we're interested in here in these debates, because I think we're all, in our different ways, in the business of education. And part of that task is to apply insights from Bakhtin to understanding where we are at the moment in this new internet age and how we can take it forward to possible utopias, possible better visions for humanity. And that's where I'm going to leave. I'm sorry about the rush at the end. I just took on too big a task, and I apologize. I hope it was interesting.
I think because that has provoked a lot of ideas in me, at least. That if you are happy, we might have just 2 questions. And then you can go and talk in some nooks and crannies. So that'll be 1 and that'll be 2.
Interesting it was.
Thank you.
Well, one of the subtitles of the conference is the limits of dialogue here. The impression I get from your presentation was there are no limits to dialogue. Would that be a fair comment? Another thing as well, you, I think correctly, problematise the boundaries between the natural and the human sciences, but Bakhtin doesn't. Bakhtin has a very rigid distinction between the natural and the human sciences. This is one of the meanings, one of the many meanings of dialogue that he has, that it's a dialogic human sciences and a monologic natural sciences. He has a very rigid distinction between these things. I wonder how you think that really plays out. And one of the ways in which this perhaps manifests itself is when you talk about the printing press. Interestingly, Bakhtin writes very interesting things about the history of the novel and so on. Massively conspicuous by its absence is the printing press. He doesn't mention it at all. He doesn't mention the publishing industry. He doesn't mention the spread of literacy. He doesn't mention any of those institutional economic factors, because for him, these are matters for the monological natural sciences, which includes economics. Now, interestingly, I think it's fair enough to develop these things, but you have to go way beyond Bakhtin, because Bakhtin doesn't provide us with a way of looking at these things. When we go on then to talk about the internet and the enormous great potential that it has, and absolutely it does, the thing that threatens the internet freedom more than any other is corporatisation, is the encroachment of institutions of power onto the internet itself. And this is something that Bakhtin really doesn't help us to theorise and doesn't help us to actually find a way forward from. So it seems to me there are significant potentials in where we can use Bakhtin in this, but there are serious limitations. We need to acknowledge those if we're going to actually use those ideas creatively and go beyond them.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. I was talking about my response to Bakhtin. I did notice that he made this distinction between the natural and the physical sciences, which is one that everybody made in the 70s, qualitative, quantitative, and that was probably big in the 20s. On the other hand, he does occasionally mention Heisenberg, Einstein, and the quote I gave about thought at the event is going a bit beyond that. And I think the logic of dialogism goes way beyond that. And so basically he was just off his time and he had limits. I think personally I'm not a Bakhtin groupie. I'm inspired by dialogism, and I've tried to apply it and take it forward. Of course, but it's important to raise these points because out of politeness we might not. Nothing is the dialogic thing, Bakhtin thing. The limits of dialogism were not mentioned, but I did have a little joke about not thinking outside. Occasionally, it's not appropriate to cross over the boundaries. The point about monologism is incredibly, this is a talk about dialogism. Monologism is incredibly powerful, incredibly effective. There's some reason why we have it. I would see it in terms of an ultimate dialogue, and you can look at that in mathematics. How can you work in mathematics? Well, the Gödel's theorem will show that naturally, however systematic your axioms are, however powerful, there's always an outside. It's never a complete system. So the dialogic is a kind of ontological commitment, but it doesn't mean that there's not an awful lot of stuff which doesn't work with dialogue, which actually works very well in a slightly more systematic way. What was the other point you raised? I'm trying to address
institutions. For the printing press.
Oh yeah. Well, the Bakhtin didn't cover them, but obviously the novel depends on that sort of thing, and the spread of the novel, and the construction of national identities out of capitalism and all that sort of thing. Obviously, I'm not sure what was motivating Bakhtin, and some people don't go there, but I mean, he wasn't really engaging with that historical development of communications technology, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't, and it doesn't mean that it's not very important for understanding dialogic, not just as an abstract idea, but as situated in history and developing. And one of the reasons why there's so much interest now, I would suggest, postmodernism, but also back dialogism, is a product of the opening up of the internet and the change in the thought culture that's resulted, I would argue, in part of our time. Is that a reasonable response for now, and we can discuss it more later?
Morning tea.
Sorry?
Morning tea.
Morning tea, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I agree with lots of things that you said. I have one perhaps fundamental problem, and that's a problem of natural language. If we in this room couldn't understand English, we couldn't establish a dialogue. We couldn't understand your entire presentation in any form of dialogical way. In other words, what we are doing here at this conference, exchanging ideas, we are using language, and it seems to me that language is the major form of engaging in dialogue, especially in academic communication. That's a communication that we all privilege here. We noticed, I think most of us, when we took part in the porphyry, that we're totally lost, or almost totally, if we don't understand the language.